I've had this video on my arsenal for a while, but I decided I want to save it for a special occasion because it's a special video. So for this year's New Year's Eve special, I'm gonna go over Lookism's 6 biggest theories as of right now. And no, I'm not gonna include James being Charles' second body because I've talked about that one 40 times. I'm gonna start with the current biggest theory, which I've mentioned previously in one of my other videos, with its premise being that Jinrang was framed. Yes, Jinrang, the king of Busan, was framed. Framed for what, you ask? Well, allow me to elaborate. Around a couple hundred chapters ago, specifically chapter 175, back when Jiho was still alive, and not only was he still alive, but he had just committed the crime of almost killing Daniel's second body, Jiho was having a very friendly conversation with Mr. Detective, and this detective decided to drop an information dump that was initially meant to fearmonger Jiho and his parents as well. What this detective said was that there was a kid, just like Jiho. Later, they found he had hid all the evidence, conspiracy to commit murder, tampering with evidence, false testimony. He didn't even show any remorse. He went to jail at the same age as Jiho, and now he's 23, which means 5 years ago when Jiho was still alive. Now keep in mind, the average age of a first generation king is about 24 years old, and this is primarily because James Lee decided to end the first generation super early with Gite. Now what does this mean for someone like Jinrang? Well, if you guys remember when Jinrang was initially introduced, it was stated that he had just been released from prison. The interesting thing about Jinrang's release from prison though is not the mere act of him being released, but the fact that his release coincides with another event that took place around the same time, that being the fact that Justin and Chuck have now been sent to prison. Not only were they sent to prison, but they were framed for the murder of Gapryong Kim. Having finally found the suspects, or who the feds think were the actual murderers or culprits behind the Gapryong Kim murder, they no longer need to keep Jinrang behind bars. Therefore, he's been released. And if someone like Eugene, the person who runs the workers, has the ability to fabricate evidence for the murder of Gapryong Kim by 2 random gang members who were probably children at the time, imagine what someone like Charles Choi, the genius of hiding evidence, and the man who was not only the second in command of Gapryong Kim's gang, but also someone who's been affiliated with James Lee, the man who killed Gapryong with Gite for a long time now. He most likely had them kill Gapryong, or they killed him out of their own will, and he hid the evidence, framing Jinrang, his own disciple, for his murder. If you guys want to, you can let me know your thoughts regarding this theory in the comment section down below, because I've heard mixed opinions on it so far. Some think it's plausible but unlikely, some think it's plausible and likely, such as me, and some think it's implausible. What do you guys think? Anyway, moving on to the second theory, this one's also related to Jinrang, and I've also mentioned it in a previous video. However, I'm gonna mention it again because I've been seeing it on TikTok pretty frequently, and this theory has to do with Jae-gyeon-na. If you guys remember Jae-gyeon-na's introduction, one of the primary things the community noted about the guy, which was what made him so interesting and distinct from the other kings at the time, was the fact that he was the only king besides Seongji who didn't have one of his body parts taken from him by James Lee. Not only that, but he was also completely uninjured with not even a scratch on his body, except for one spot. And at that time, that spot, being his right hand, and specifically his middle finger, didn't really hold much significance, mainly because there was no context really given behind it. It was just a finger scar that looked like a ring had been there, or maybe his hand was cut off by an alarmingly thick object. Nobody really said anything about it at the time. That was until Jinrang was introduced. Throughout his introduction, not only did PTJ make a valiant effort to emphasize the ring on Jinrang's finger, which the meaning behind I've mentioned in a previous video revolving around everything we know about Jinrang, but also during his introduction, the only first generation king we saw was Jae-gyeon. He was actually being informed about the release of Jinrang from prison and seemed to have quite the smug and coy expression on his face, implying that he may have been pleased at the release of the king of Busan. You connect the dots yet? Jinrang has a ring on his right hand's middle finger, symbolizing the emblem for his gang, and the only first generation king implied to have been affiliated with him and pleased at the news of his release has a ring-shaped scar in his right hand's middle finger. Was Jae-gyeon a member of Jinrang's gang? Is Jae-gyeon the only alive first generation king out of jail that doesn't have a disciple? The third theory I'm gonna mention is one that is also related to Busan but not strictly Jinrang, and so the latest chapter of Lookism, that being 534 at the time of recording this, and I'm assuming this is also gonna be applicable to chapter 535, ended with a panel of Busan's right hand man, whose name we don't know of yet, having his mouth widely open and every single one of his teeth being replaced with a synthetic seemingly metal tooth, except for the 4 at the front of the top layer. Now I know there isn't much information regarding this man so far, but I've been seeing a theory going around not only on Reddit or TikTok or Discord, but my community posts as well, stating that the reason behind this man replacing his teeth with synthetic teeth is that James took his real teeth out in a fight. Yeah, I'm aware it's quite a bizarre theory, but allow me to elaborate. The theory takes up the premise that when this panel was first illustrated, Jinrang's right-hand man uttered the words, "A plan? No chance. I was waiting for you, James Lee." It's quite a minuscule theory because there's not much we know about this man or Busan in general. However, basically, since this man is the only member of the Jinrang gang other than Jinrang himself who possesses the golden ring signifying leadership over the entire gang, people are theorizing that during the first generation, when James Lee was in pursuit of his plan to take down all of the first generation kings and take one of their body parts, Jinrang was in prison, possibly for the murder of Gapryong Kim or for any other reason, and so during his stay in prison, someone had to take his position as the head of the crew and the current king of Busan, and so therefore this man took his place, had a meeting with James, and James was having a little fun in his mouth and found it pleasurable to take his teeth out. That is the main reason he's been waiting for James and seemingly fiending to get his revenge on him. Now, with the 3 theories relating to Jinrang and Busan out the way, I want to talk about Goo.
So I'm a big advocate for Goo Kim being the third son of Gapryong. Think about it really slowly right now. Why else would Gitae be in contact with Goo? And Goo is also the age between Gitae and Jake. He's like 20, 21 right now. Jake's like, what, 18? So it just makes sense that he's the third son, or there's probably multiple sons of Gapryong. But I genuinely think Goo is one of them. He's a weapons master. He probably was like an illegitimate child. So, you know, Gapryong didn't pay much attention to him. That explains why he's so ridiculously strong. And he probably dyed his hair just to like, I think he dyed his hair, right? Because no way, or maybe his mother had blonde hair, right? We're gonna see in the Goo Kim backstory. And they had the last name Kim. Like, I know Kim's like a common last name, but come on, it's there. The potential's there.
Alright, bro. I don't know being the biggest Lookism YouTuber came with the perk of just taking over anyone's video like that, but thank you, I guess. Alright, now the last 2 theories I want to talk about in this video are slightly more niche than the previous 4 me and VMAT have talked about, and they are both relating to the man with the potential to sit on the porcelain throne of villains for Lookism right now, James Lee. The first theory I'm going to talk about revolves around the proposition that James Lee is making himself look like Daniel Park. I know it sounds weird, but so does every other fucking theory in this video, so let me cook for a minute. 3 chapters ago, during Daniel and James' first meeting after a time skip, James told Daniel about the fact that Charles Choi isn't dead. While physically he might be deceased, his remnants are still there. He was referring to Jinrang, the king of Busan, whom he subsequently introduced Daniel to through a phone screen, painting him in a very obviously pejorative light. James, manipulating Daniel under the basis that Jinrang is 100% related to Charles Choi in some way, utilizes Charles' evil acts and wrongdoings to paint Jinrang as some sort of villain, even stating that the seeds of evil Charles Choi planted haven't disappeared after his death. Now, Daniel already has a corrupted and derogatively biased perspective towards the likes of Jinrang and Busan, and so going forth with anything, he's gonna treat Jinrang as a villain. So what does this mean for James Lee, taking into consideration that Daniel's dumbass, with absolutely zero evidence whatsoever, has decided to take James' word as undeniable gospel and go after Busan, starting with the 4 major crews? James has it easy because he doesn't really need to do anything in order to take down the only man who could be in the way of his plan, Jinrang, and stop him from being a villain. All he needs to do is send Daniel over, and since Daniel shares the same mindset as James now, viewing Jinrang as the Charles incarnate and the absolute scum of the earth, he's gonna be aiming for Jinrang's head, leading to a fight between the two. And now that James has seen Daniel fight and knows his capabilities when he's in UI, he's probably confident in the fact that Daniel can take him down or at least weaken him for them. This theory ties into another theory I mentioned earlier on in this video, which is the one stating that Jinrang was framed. Now let's say that theory ends up being true and Jinrang was actually framed for the murder of Gapryong Kim. Wouldn't that be an obstacle in the way of James' plan and make it so that Jinrang would be going after James and know that Daniel isn't the man he's looking for? Well, this is where the main premise of the theory comes into play. With the recent release of Jinrang from prison and the retiring of James Lee, also known as DG, from the K-pop industry at around the same time, seeing as though he's a big figure in the country, Jinrang will have most likely seen this news and been updated regarding the appearance of James Lee, the man who framed him for the killing of Gapryong Kim. And now that he knows James has black hair, knows his body type, and can recognize his face, he'll be searching for a man that looks like that. So therefore, James' smartest decision is to put his appearance altering skills to use and impersonate the person whom he's sending over to fight Jinrang and help James with his plan, aka Daniel Park. Changing his hair color, taking Daniel's body measurements to quote-unquote tailor a suit to his size because James really cares about whether or not Daniel has a custom suit. You get the gist. Now the final theory I want to talk about in this video is one that I've actually made a separate video about due to how long it was and how plausible I think it is. And in that video I mentioned that I came up with that theory while writing the script for this one. The theory basically goes that Daniel Park is pretty much the real villain behind this arc. And as I mentioned earlier, the theory is related to James Lee primarily, but it's also more specifically revolving around just how dumb and gullible Daniel has been throughout this arc so far, believing anything anyone says without verifying whether or not they're reliable or trustworthy. He meets up with James Lee in chapter 531 after James calls him, and James proceeds to indoctrinate him and tell him how Charles Choi isn't dead and his remnants are still around somewhere. And then he makes Daniel believe that Charles Choi's remnants are left in Busan, showing him Jinrang, the king of Busan, and how he's a villain and just painting him in a very pejorative light. Daniel believes James and goes straight to Busan, not taking into account the fact that James Lee could potentially be the remnants of Charles Choi he was talking about. And when Daniel finally leaves, James begins talking to Gitae about how they need Daniel for their plan and that they could use him if they want to which Gitae replies, their plan is finally starting, basically just saying it to our face that they're planning on using Daniel for everything they do. Daniel arrives at Busan, and I'm only gonna go over this briefly because as I mentioned earlier it's really long, but he meets up with Choi Bongpal, a mass drug dealer, and after she confesses to him that she wants to take down the 4 major crews, or at least one of them, and take its place, he uses a toy lie detector contact her to ask her about the cruise, not taking into consideration that she could literally just be lying the whole time. After leaving Choi Bang-pal, Allied head to the 4 major crews and tried to find them, whilst Choi admits that she never even showed them her real drugs, meaning she was never trustworthy of them in the first place, knowing they would betray her. So there's no reason for us to believe that her saying should I trust them this one time means she told them the truth. She could just be trusting them to do her job for her. I skipped over a couple details when it comes to the beginning of this theory regarding Bang-pal and Sonang, so if you want to see that then check out the full video here. But the final part of this theory basically states that none of the 4 major cruise businesses that Daniel is trying to take down is actually illegal or unethical. The first business is not only legal but also being encouraged by one of the members of Allied, Hudson, who is trying to start Ansan Public's own branch in Busan. The second business is completely legal and the crew head even encourages ethical and moral gambling, announcing to his customers that they need to be fair in gambling and even avoiding breaking any laws by not exchanging chips for cash. The third crew is just the UFC without any rules. I don't really think I need to go over that one, and I'm referring to the one Daniel's trying to take down, by the way. And the fourth business was never compared to be trading young girls. In fact, it's comically more likely that they're just trading fish and sinking their ships into the sea when they have issues because they have fish in them and not real people. Anyway, that's gonna be it. I hope you enjoyed. Peace.